Okay, Year 11, welcome to part 2 of what I was talking about in a previous video, 1963 to 1965 protests and legislation. In this video, this one's going to be quite short, I think, because I just want to talk about what happened in at the end of 1963 and 1964. I'll talk about 1965 in the next video in part 3. I'm going to talk, as I say, about what happens straight after the death of JFK that I ended the previous video with, which is obviously at the end of 1963 in November, and then what happens in 1964 in terms of, as I say, protests and civil rights legislation. So, as I said, JFK is assassinated on the 22nd of November 1963, and that's where I'm going to pick up from. Now, you'll remember that just before he died, from about August, well, a little bit before August, but throughout the summer and the autumn of 1963, JFK, or Kennedy, as I should say, had been pushing through the Civil Rights Bill in Congress, or trying to, and he'd been having quite a lot of trouble. There'd been many congressmen, if you'll remember, who didn't want to vote for this, or I should say southern congressmen. Most of the congressmen in the north are quite happy with the Civil Rights Bill. I think it's a good thing, but as we know, a lot of congressmen in the south didn't want to vote for it, either because they themselves were racist and they didn't want to give African American people more rights, or that they themselves weren't racist but they knew that a lot of their voters were, and if they voted for the Civil Rights Bill to get it passed and make it become a law, that many of their voters would say, right, I'm not voting for you again because you have gone against my wishes, and I'm a voter, so I'm not going to vote for you. So in November, as I say, Kennedy is assassinated, and it looks as if the Civil Rights Bill is going to, fall, because the man who has been pushing it through is dead. Now, Kennedy was replaced by his vice president, a man called Lyndon Johnson. He's also sometimes shortened to 3 letters, like John F. Kennedy, JFK. Lyndon Johnson is sometimes referred to as LBJ, because his name was Lyndon Baines Johnson, so LBJ. But Johnson, as I say, replaced Kennedy, and Johnson as well had been, or was, a bit of a civil rights activist as well. He was very pro-civil rights, and he, fortunately for Kennedy and for the African Americans in America, Johnson pushed through with the Civil Rights Bill and got it passed through Congress. He used a number of tactics to get it pushed through in Congress. I mean, one was sympathy. JFK has been very sadly and very shockingly assassinated, so let's push this through and make it part of his legacy. So that was one of the tactics that Johnson used. We owe it to our previous president, our fallen president, to get this passed. There was also a little bit of bullying tactics. LBJ could be quite forceful when he wanted to be and needed to be, but regardless, LBJ Johnson manages to get the Civil Rights Act, or Civil Rights Bill, I should say, pushed through Congress, and it is passed on the 2nd of July 1964, so the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 2nd of July 1964 is when it gets passed. Now, it states the following things: segregation and discrimination in public places, education and businesses is banned. Okay, segregation and discrimination is banned in public places, education and business by this act here. Okay, voter registration tests have got to be fair, and they've got to be the same for white and black people. You can't have the same test for, or one test, for a white person and a different test for a black person. They've got to be fair and exactly the same regardless of race. Okay, discrimination in employment is banned. And also something else is set up called the Equal Opportunities Commission. I should have written that down. The Equal Opportunities Commission is set up, and that investigates discrimination in employment. Remember, the Civil Rights Act doesn't just deal with African American people. It tries to make society fairer for everybody, whether you're black or white, male or female, what have you. It tries to get rid of discrimination in employment and public areas and education and business and all of those kind of things. So, as I was saying before about the Equal Opportunities Commission, that's set up to make sure that people are not being discriminated in the workplace, or indeed when they're applying for a job. That, you know, if an application for a job comes in and the employer or potential employer sees that that person is black, they don't just go, right, getting rid of that one, or oh, they're a woman, getting rid of that one. It tries to end discrimination in, as I say, business and employment. One other thing that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 brings through, or proposes, is that the federal government can actually remove funding from states, or state projects I should say, that discriminate. So for example, if the state of, I don't know, Mississippi doesn't follow these rules, these laws, then the federal government can say, right, well, we're not giving you any money to fund, I don't know, that new freeway that you're building or what have you. Okay, so the government has got a little bit of teeth in this. It's saying, look, if you don't follow this, we can punish you. States that don't abide by this act can be punished. Okay, if we find out that they are not going through with these laws and these rules. So, as you can tell from the things that I've just listed there, this is a huge moment for the civil rights movement. They've achieved something quite big. Suddenly, a lot of the demands that they've been calling for, you know, an end to discrimination, an end to segregation, they've achieved that. You know, this act essentially bans segregation. Remember, the Plessy versus Ferguson case had said segregation is legal as long as the facilities are equal. So the facilities for black people and white people are exactly the same, but you can have them segregated. You can have one for whites and one for blacks. That's over. Okay, segregation full stop is now banned or illegal. Okay, so it's a huge moment for the civil rights movement. One of their chief aims has on paper been met, but there's one problem, or one major lingering problem with this Civil Rights Act. Yes, it bans or makes illegal segregation, but racism and discrimination does not go away. Okay, as we know, African Americans were subject to lots of racism and discrimination on a daily basis. You know, going out and about their day, they were victim to an awful lot of racism and discrimination. That doesn't go away. Okay, it's something that's been really common, particularly in the southern states, and no act or law is or any act or law is going to struggle to get rid of that. It's almost become a way of life in the South. So this doesn't get rid of pure racism. It gets rid of segregation, but racism and discrimination still remains. Remember as well, it's also, we talked about this in class year 11, it's very difficult to enforce these laws. Okay, America's a huge place, and it's very difficult to make sure that every single employer isn't discriminating. It's very difficult to make sure that shops aren't letting black people in for racist reasons or what have you. It's very difficult to enforce some of these laws. Now, the Civil Rights Act as well it's already annoyed white people, I should say. White people are very annoyed by it because naturally, in the South again, particularly, a lot of white people or white racists are quite angered by this because, again, African Americans are getting rights and getting things that white people don't feel they should have. But it also angers quite a lot of African Americans because they look at the Civil Rights Act and they go, well, hang on, there's something that we really don't like about this, or something that we feel hasn't gone far enough. Yes, voter registration tests have got to be fair, but that still means that many African American people won't be able to register to vote because those tests are still there, and for some African Americans, or a lot of African Americans, they still find it very, very hard to complete those tests. Okay, so it's not gone far enough in terms of voting rights in particular. So many African Americans really aren't happy with this, and it's another year before that problem is solved, or attempts to be properly solved by Lyndon Johnson. I'm going to talk about that in my next video. Okay, so the next video, part 3, is going to talk about what happens in 1965. Two things in particular. Number one, the Selma March that we've talked about a lot in class, but I'll talk about that in the next video. And number two, the Voting Rights Act, which comes about as part of the Selma March. So that's what I'll talk about in the next video, in part 3, the Selma March and the Voting Rights Act. But hopefully that video has cleared up a few issues that any of you might have been having with the Civil Rights Act and what happens in 1964. Remember, there's plenty of information in the textbook. There should be plenty of information in your exercise book as well, if you're looking to revise that for the mocks and for the real exams in the summer. But there you go. That's what happens in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act. Next video, 1965, Selma March and the Voting Rights Act. See you very soon.